I think we have to remember who Matt Taibbi is because,
Mm.
like, I think, there's this kind of perception that has been deliberately cultivated. I don't, Matt Taibbi is somebody who has forever been associated with the left for good reason.
Yeah.
And, some of this ideological scrambling has happened to the point that even though you are the press secretary for the most viable left-wing presidential candidate, in the last century, I would say, or at least the last several decades, people question whether you're an actual leftist as well.
Of course.
So a lot of this kind of, questioning has gone on. But, Matt is somebody who he has a kind of feature on his Substack called Meet the Censored, where he gives a platform to, people that week who have been kicked off YouTube unjustly because of their political views or who have been banned from Twitter. And he goes out of his way to make sure that it's ideologically diverse, to avoid the narrative that it's only conservatives who are being censored. He not only understands that leftists get censored, but he is engaged actively in efforts to demonstrate that, including to the part of his audience that's conservative, because Matt comes from the left. And I will say that, I think that I'm one of the people who has been most vocal in my criticisms of big tech censorship. And I just did a part of my show, I think a week ago, where I made the point for the 100th time that the way to understand online censorship is not left versus right. It's not conservatives who are being censored from the internet. Mitch McConnell and Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham, kind of just like standard establishment conservatives, Mitt Romney, whoever, none of those people are being censored from the internet. They're not going after conservatives. They're conservatives. They're Republicans. They have, their chance that someone like them would be censored is zero. The people who are being censored are anti-establishment voices on both the left and the right.
I mean,
and the thing I always,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
let me just say, because the very first reporting I ever did, Brie, on big tech censorship was in 2016 when I got this list, this communication between Facebook and the Israeli government. And it turned out that every month the Israelis submit to Facebook a list of Palestinian journalists and media outlets and activists that they claim are inciting terrorism, by which we all know the Israeli government means by inciting terrorism, criticizing the Israeli occupation. And in 95% of the cases, Facebook obeys the Israeli requests to censor. The people who have been among the most censored in the West are critics of Israel and activists for the Palestinian cause.
Right.
So, I mean, to the extent that you're saying that you wish there had been journalists more sympathetic to that perspective and were willing to look more into it, for me, one of the main people who has been most even-handed in his censorship critique is Matt Taibbi.
No, I agree with that, Glenn.
But let me just, because I think the reality though is that once Donald Trump was elected, and especially as the re-election campaign was approaching, and with Russiagate, and then especially with January 6th, it did become the case that the establishment in Washington, establishment neoliberal power centers in the West, began to regard right-wing populism as the biggest threat. And that's why the sitting president of the United States, who was censored, was a conservative, was Donald Trump. One of the most extraordinary acts of censorship. The censorship that they did before the election was censorship of reporting that reflected negatively not on Donald Trump, but on Joe Biden through the New York Post. So there is a disproportionate targeting of right-wing anti-establishment voices just because they're stronger and more threatening. But I agree with you completely that the censorship regime is not about right versus left, but about anti-establishment voices being silenced on both the left and the right.
But I think that's the problem, Glenn. We just got to take kind of everybody's word for it. And it's not about, certainly not about Matt Taibbi's ideological biases or anything like that. But given the volume of this archive and given the limited number of people that are in it and involved, people are doing targeted searches that are determined by what their interest is, right? So if you are, I will completely admit, if it were me with all my biases and my interests, I would be running search terms that are probably farther back than other people, because I'm still very curious about what happened in 2016 and 2020 around Bernie, as opposed to focusing around, you know, the last two, you know, the just the 2020
like
period and the end of the Trump era,
COVID
and
dissidents and
exactly.
conservatives
And
and all that, right?
there's nothing wrong there. I have no critique of people who want to focus on the COVID misinformation. It's obvious, to your point, why COVID misinformation and some of these more conservative leaning issues would be of interest right now. But that doesn't mean that I still don't have an interest in understanding what my long-term censorship interests, problems with Twitter have been. And I would be running searches along those lines that were longer time frame wise, that were looking at censorship of, I would focus, for instance, probably on censorship of people who are pro-Palestine in a way that maybe someone like Barry Weiss wouldn't do. You know, and that we all have our priors, and that, I think that's part of what the distrust is. Part of it is completely bad faith and people who just don't like Matt Taibbi and the rest of the crew because they don't agree with what their politics or what they think their politics are. Okay. But there's this other part of it as a leftist who is very interested in this project of exposing online bias, in part because I have observed the ways that has it affected the left. And historically, this kind of censorship has disproportionately, in fact, affected the left. And it just feels like an easy opportunity to expand the kind of the broader social purchase into the relevance of the Twitter files, to do what you, in fact, described doing, which is to, one, be able to have more reach in the media space by partnering with institutions that have more reach and more resources. And two, by, however unfair it is, addressing the perception that the folks who are reviewing the archive have a limited set of political interests and are following their ideological priors in a way that is excluding some other relevant and interesting information.
Right. So I guess, first of all, let me just say that the critique you're voicing is a much more reasonable one than I think was the dominant critique from media corporations. I think
for sure. They just hated Matt Taibbi.
Yeah. Well, I'm not even sure it's so much they hated Matt Taibbi. Like I said, I think part of it is they're angry when independent journalists get stories. But I also think we have to remember that the censorship regime that this reporting was designed to expose is a regime that most of these media corporations support. In fact, they agitate for it. Their one critique of the big tech censorship regime is that they don't censor enough. That's the formal position of the Democratic Party as well. So I think they were angry that the target of this reporting was something that they support. Just like there was a lot of anger when we were doing the NSA reporting, because there are a lot of people in Washington who support what the NSA was doing. They were angry we were exposing something that they support. So I think it's very important to distinguish your reasonable critiques from what became the dominant critique from the media. That's the first thing. The second thing is, again, the critique that you're voicing, reasonable though it may be, is applicable to almost every single story that we ever hear about. Every single form of reporting that we hear about, your critique applies to. The CIA goes to CNN. The Pentagon goes to the New York Times. They choose the reporters they know are going to report the story in the way that they want because they're choosing the reporters who are ideologically aligned with their agenda. This is a critique that applies to all journalism, not just the journalism in this specific case. So that's one thing. The other thing is, the critique you're making is not really a critique of Matt Taibbi or the journalist. It's a critique of Elon Musk. Because,
100%.
Like in the Snowden story, Snowden gave me the archive, and I was free to do with it what I wanted. And so one of the things that I did, although not right away, we had, it was a very sensitive process. We opened it up to a lot of other newsrooms around the world, but that took a while. Same thing with the Brazilian reporting. Like I said, the first thing with that archive I did was I secured it in the United States so the Brazilian government couldn't get it. I reported the first set of stories myself, and only then did I start opening it up. The big difference, though, is that in those cases, or in the WikiLeaks cases, the people who possessed the archive and therefore could control what was done with it were the journalists themselves, myself or WikiLeaks or whomever. In this case, what we're talking about are the corporate files of Twitter. And so the idea that Elon Musk is going to dump the entire corporate files of Twitter onto the internet or just have like a free-for-all where every journalist gets to come in and pick and choose the parts they want, including institutions he doesn't trust, I just don't think is realistic. But let me just say, I agree. I agree with you, or or you could say, well, then why not bring in some leftists?
Why not? Why not you, Glenn? I was kind of expecting that you would be an obvious choice for someone in this position. Would you be interested?
The problem was, and of course, people talk to me who are in this process about doing it. I wasn't Elon's first choice. It was Matt. The problem is, in order to do it, everyone who did it had to fly to San Francisco. And just because of my husband's, health situation, I would never leave the country with David, still in ICU and with my kids needing support. So for personal reasons, I wouldn't have done it. I probably would not have felt totally comfortable, to be honest, with the way in which it was done, in the sense that they were the guardians of the information, and the only information that you end up getting is information they decide to give you. And I'm not willing to kind of be manipulated by the possibility that people are handpicking what they want me to see or don't want me to see, because that can end up causing me or putting me in the position where I'm unwittingly serving as a spokesperson for an agenda that is not mine.
Glenn, isn't that kind of a big deal? Isn't that kind of a significant critique? And I think probably one of the only good faith critiques that's come down about everybody, including people whose journalism I respect so much, like Matt Taibbi, is that if you aren't able to have direct access to the primary documents, if you are, to your point, being served up some kind of sliver. I mean, I've seen Matt asked in like a call-in situation, what about censorship of the left? And he said, well, I just haven't seen very much of that. And maybe that's true. Maybe Twitter just had not that much interest in censoring the left. Fine. But when you are only getting a piece of the pie, it puts someone who is a good faith actor like Matt Taibbi in the position of making a representation, like Twitter wasn't that focused on censoring the left, that he might not be able to realistically speak to truthfully because he only has a piece of the picture.
Right. All he can say is, I didn't see it. And the reason he maybe didn't see it is because he wasn't shown it. So I guess, again, first of all, let me just say that there were no real left-wing journalists brought in, although like a framework that doesn't count Matt Taibbi and Li Feng as leftist is one that I don't fully trust. But like, it is true that people who are, say, like real leftists were not brought in. But notice as well that there were no real like MAGA journalists or far-right journalists. They didn't invite Breitbart in or, Charlie Kirk in. I mean, I think Elon's vision of politics is a little bit simplistic. He thinks he's supposed to avoid the far left and the far right, and the people in the middle are the ones you trust. And to him, the middle is Barry Weiss, Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberger, these kind of people. And I think that was sort of what guided him. The critique that you're making, that you only get what the source shows you, and therefore the source may end up being able to manipulate your journalism, is completely correct. All I'm saying, once again, though, is that this is always how it is. Always how it is. How did the New York Times know when Daniel Ellsberg brought them the Pentagon Papers that there weren't chapters of those papers that he saw but left out because it contradicted the narrative that he wanted the New York Times to advance, which was that the U.S. government was lying to the American people about their view that they could win in Vietnam? You of course you don't know that. But at the end of the day, the question is what you have in your hands on its own something that you trust to tell part of the story in a way that's helpful? And what Matt had in his hand was clear evidence that the FBI and the CIA and Homeland Security were intervening in the decision-making processes of Twitter and influencing the decision-making about who should and should be censored. Whatever else was going on in Twitter, that in itself is a huge story that you're going to report, even if there's other documents you think that you're not seeing.
I think that's true and legitimate. I think the concern that people have, and the concern I should speak for myself that I have, is that the less explicit implications of the Twitter files are kind of beyond any of our actual knowledge. So reporting on, the suppression of various journalists or just medical professionals who were tweeting inconvenient facts about COVID. That is a thing that happened and is worth reporting on. The reporting on the relationship between the FBI and the pressure that they put on Twitter to take down certain or to frankly obscure the extent to which all of these accounts, this was Lee's reporting, were in fact fake government accounts that were speaking in Arabic and making it seem like everybody in various countries around the world just loved regime change. That's a fact that's worth reporting about. But this broader implication that I think has really taken so much of the right-leaning parts of the country by storm, that there is a big media conspiracy to target the right, not, as you put it, to target anti-establishment forces, which I think is right and true, but to target the right in particular. And that as a consequence, people should entrench themselves in the right and defend the right, which people confuse. It is as a kind of political entity that it is inclusive of establishment actors, because I think those lines aren't being finely enough drawn. That is my concern. The implication that the left and other establishment people that are not right-leaning are completely wiped out of this narrative. It is a concern for me. And it's, I think, doubly a concern. I mean, I think it's no accident that Lee's reporting stood out for me, because he was using his own search terms. Like, he was providing search terms, searches were being run and they were being delivered to him. So he was getting to a part of the archive that might not have been handed over to him if someone else were doing the picking. And I can't help but wonder what else is in there if more of that kind of exploration were allowed. That's all.
And maybe, again, like in both the Snowden case, the Brazil case, the WikiLeaks case, the amount of people and the range of people who had access to the archive expanded over time, and therefore more reporting was enabled. And I hope that will happen here. The one thing I would hasten to add, however, is that I would, I guess, take issue a little bit with the notion that the big takeaway from the Twitter files became that conservatives were being systemically censored by big tech. Of course, conservatives believe that. I think there's evidence that it's true in the limited way I talked about earlier. But I don't think Matt pushed that narrative. I don't even think Barry Weiss pushed that narrative. I think the big takeaway ended up being, for me at least, the big part of that story was the involvement of the U.S. security services in the information flow that American citizens are and aren't getting. There was already this pre-existing concern about conservative voices being censored. And I just, I will say that again, I mean, I do everything possible to get people in general to stop thinking about the world as left versus right. Because for me, and we've talked about this before, I believe at least as important of a way of understanding the world is anti-establishment versus pro-establishment. Where populist, groups on both sides have more in common than they actually like to recognize. And that's definitely true of who gets censored. Nonetheless, you can put a long list of prominent elected officials and major media figures who ended up being censored by big tech, and almost all of them are conservative within, say, the last 2 years. The leftists who get censored tend to be people with smaller platforms. That's just true. Like,
sure.
And so,
well, leftists on the whole, I think, just we don't have comparable media figures for various reasons. I mean, we don't have let's say a Turning Point USA who is going to take a random human, like, let's say a Kyle Rittenhouse, and elevate them to kind of a national status, give them media opportunities, book deals. We just don't have that. So,
no, but we have like AOC and Ilhan Omar and Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, but those are politicians.
None of them have been. I know, but like Rand Paul had like a Senate hearing that he put it on his own YouTube channel, censored because the witnesses that he was interviewing, who were highly credentialed scientists, were talking about studies they were doing into whether various alternative treatments were effective for COVID, which at the time was a violation of YouTube and Google's. That's a United States senator who got censored.
Yeah, I get that, but also RT was taken off of the internet. Abby Martin lost her entire show archive. Chris Hedge. I mean, there are, to the extent that we do have some institutionalized left media that runs afoul of these runs afoul of what the mainstream.
Bree, this is my song. I mean, I couldn't, it's ironic. I feel like I'm pushing back against my own view because, every time there's a crisis, the censorship escalates. And the last crisis that was used to censor was the war in Ukraine. And many, many leftists ended up booted off YouTube. One of the reasons why I'm at Rumble is because they open their arms to everybody who gets censored by big tech, including people on the right and left. And there was also a lot of left-wing dissidents on COVID. Jeremy Corbyn was famously opposed to vaccine mandates and against having healthcare workers lose their jobs for refusing to get vaccinated. So that I agree completely that the censorship regime is about anti-establishment voices, many of whom end up on the left. We're in total agreement on that. I think the reason, though, that more attention ends up getting paid to the censorship of conservatives is because starting with the president of the United States himself, there have been many, many major political figures on the right who have been censored, and that's not really true of the left. The people on the left who tend to get censored are mint press, Palestinian activists. I'm not saying it's not as bad. It is as bad.
Well,
it's
just
not as well known.
It's difficult because we don't know. So we've never had a left president. So, oh well. But I don't mean to make this so Bernie focused because I certainly have my critiques of Bernie and it feels a little sad to be talking about the stuff that happened so long ago. But given what we know, what has been reported minimally about the K-Hive bot army and about the NAFO bot army, these paid attempts to actually affect the discourse on Twitter, and the rhetoric around the Bernie bro phenomenon seems like the most incredible case of projection whatsoever, because it was organic. It was not bot driven. People just liked Bernie. And to go back and look at the way the media was giving so much free press to both Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and some incredible number, $70 million of free press the day after Biden won South Carolina. The censorship might not necessarily be taking people off the internet per se, but there are choices that are being made by media institutions, I'm sure including Twitter, about what messages to suppress and which to elevate that could have implicated people in Congress and could have implicated people like Bernie Sanders. Ari Robinhoff reported in his book that in a senatorial context, Bernie Sanders' team met with Facebook because they saw a marked shift in the traction that their posts were getting. He was very, very popular on social media. That was where all his power was coming from. And then in a drop of a dime, his posts weren't getting any information. And when they sat down with Facebook, Facebook basically told them, well, if you want to get traction again, let me run the content on your account. One part that was completely new to me was this conversation, this meeting that Bernie Sanders, yourself, and I think some other staffers had with the Facebook team about algorithmic changes that really significantly impacted the reach of Bernie's kind of online Facebook presence, and the kind of openness with which the Facebook team said that the campaign should basically defer to them as to how they
it wasn't the campaign
package Bernie's message. So go ahead.
It was the Senate office, which made it far worse. So what happened was Bernie had this tremendous rise on Facebook. We had a really successful online video program because Armand is a genius, basically, and drove the work of
producer Armand, for people who don't know.
Producer Armand is literally a genius, and would literally did the work of that video team of 10 people in the Senate office. It was one of the most remarkable things I've seen, actually. And we would gain, and Georgia Park, who people don't necessarily know, but kind of did Bernie's social media for years, just brilliant. And we saw our numbers rising. Then one day, literally out of nowhere, and this is the Senate office page, Facebook page, stopped getting followers. And it just dead stopped. And we were like, this is strange. And there was a series of meetings with a number of Facebook people, including at one point Adam Mosseri, who now is the head of Instagram, including a phone call with Sheryl Sandberg, where Bernie wanted to address not what was going on with his Facebook page, but what's going on. How are you deciding what a government office should say to their constituents? And like, it's one thing for like you to decide what corporation should say, but you're suggesting Facebook should be in the middle of a government office and its constituents and how they were deciding who gets what content. And he really was digging in on the algorithm with them. And it was much bigger than his own page. It just, his own page is what caused him to notice it. And at one point, they denied there was any change. Then, like, Georgia had a bunch of charts she printed out with Josh Miller Lewis, and they were like, showed the Facebook guys these charts, and they finally were like, yeah, we flipped a switch, and it cut off your supporters basically because of this change.
The kind of anti-democratic implications of saying a tech company should control the messaging of an elected senator are incredible. But those aren't the stories that get covered, and those aren't the kind of investigations that seem to be being pursued. I mean, I understand that with Facebook and this is Twitter, but we can only imagine the implications because there doesn't seem to have been really much interest in investigating that aspect of what was going on in the app. I don't want to belabor this point too much.
No, but it's crucial because I just want to pick up on something you said that's so important, which is there's lots of ways to censor information without, say, explicitly banning somebody, right? Just like there's a lot of ways to punish dissent without imprisoning dissidents. That's one of the things Chomsky has always talked most about. Orwell too is, oftentimes the more subtle ways of suppressing dissent are the more effective ways than just like rounding up dissidents and putting them in prison. So for example, when the Hunter Biden reporting was censored right before the 2020 election, Twitter's censorship of it was just brute. They just banned any links to that story. Facebook's, however, was way more insidious because it was so much more subtle. They tinkered with the algorithms to prevent the story from spreading, but they didn't actually ban it. So the way in which it was suppressed was kind of invisible. I have no doubt, none, that the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016, being the threat that it was to the establishment, to the extent the DNC cheated to prevent Bernie from getting the nomination, and it's not me saying that, but Elizabeth Warren and Donna Brazile and others who might have walked it back but did say it. I have no doubt that kind of algorithmic tinkering was taking place. The Los Angeles Times reported, Bree, that David Brock was spending millions of dollars on bot armies of the kind that we keep hearing Russia was saying. And obviously, the only purpose of it was to demonize and attack supporters of Bernie Sanders. So, I agree with you completely. That's not something Elon Musk was particularly interested in. He was much more interested in these more recent kind of examples of conservative censorship that went against conservatives. And I'm sure there are documents in the Twitter files that had I had access to, I would have looked for along those lines, and certainly you would have too. Again, my hope is that they will expand the scope of the people who end up getting access to those files. I guess all I'm saying is that this critique of like incomplete reporting or the reporting being shaped by the motives of the source does apply to the Twitter files reporting, but it applies to every single article that we're reading in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, hearing from CNN and Fox and MSNBC. That's all I'm saying is...
Yeah, I take that point.
I agree with you.
It's just
not unique here.
I take that point, and it is an important point. Hey, YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you, and as always, keep the faith.